The vice president lives in a house called Number One Observatory Circle. Doesn't have the same ring as the White House. But vice presidents have only lived in this house for about 50 years. Where did they live before?
Whatever your real estate needs, get...
The wiki page for Number One Observatory Circle says prior to using this house, vice presidents lived in hotels or their own private homes. Now, I tried as hard as I could, searching the entire internet, trying to find a comprehensive list of every place where the Vice President of the United States was living during his term as Vice President of the United States, and the list doesn't exist. No one seems to care. The White House has 132 rooms and 35 bathrooms. You're telling me the Vice President can't bunk there?
You know, I could just stay downstairs on the couch.
But the reason the Vice President lives in this house is because of Spiro Agnew.
Spiro Agnew is the man.
Agnew was the VP to Richard Nixon when he was elected in 1969, and prior to that, he had been the governor of the state of Maryland. As governor, he got to live in this house. But where did Spiro Agnew live when they first moved to Washington, D.C. in 1969? Well, according to his Wikipedia page, it says he lived at the Sheraton Hotel. In fact, the suite that he stayed in at the Sheraton was the same suite that had been used by Vice President Lyndon Johnson during his time in office in the early 60s. So you could be on vacation in Washington, D.C., and you're going around seeing all the tourist attractions, and then you're all sweaty, you get back to your hotel, and you're in line at the front desk, and the vice president's behind you. I just need some shampoo. This particular Sheraton is today known as the St. Regis Hotel. We actually went there during our filming locations for DC Cab because it appears in DC Cab. Here's the Willard Hotel in Washington, D.C. This is another hotel that lodged a lot of vice presidents. Millard Fillmore, Calvin Coolidge, and a bunch of vice presidents I'd never heard of. The hotel had a small fire in April of 1922 during the time that Calvin Coolidge was living there, and he went to the fire marshal and said, "Look, I need to get back in the building. I'm the vice president." The fire marshal responded by asking, "What are you vice president of?"
They ask you how you are, and you just have to say that you're fine when you're not really fine, but you just can't get into.
Anyway, back to Spiro Agnew. He was a very unpopular and scandal-ridden vice president. So much so that they made watches mocking him. He lived at the Sheraton for a couple of years, and then he purchased a home in Virginia. In 1951, Congress passed a law that the Secret Service was now going to protect not just the president and the White House, but also the vice president and his family wherever they were living. The security upgrades to Spiro Agnew's new house cost $250,000. And that was more than double the cost to secure the home of his predecessor, Hubert Humphrey. Wow. Hubert Humphrey looks like he's about to go out and direct Pulp Fiction. Yes, a man named Hubert Humphrey was once a heartbeat away from the presidency. A man with a name that sounds like he should be a sidekick to Porky Pig in a 1943 Merry Melodies was the Vice President of the United States. And while the homes were purchased by the Vice President, these improvements were paid for by the taxpayers. Shortly after fortifying that home, Spiro Agnew was investigated by the U.S. District Attorney of the state of Maryland. Suspicion of criminal conspiracy, bribery, extortion, and tax fraud. So Spiro Agnew cost the government $250,000 to fortify that home, and 3 months later, he resigns in disgrace, he sells the home, and he gets a huge profit on the sale. The American people were not happy. The government decided it would just be easier and cheaper to protect the vice president in a home that was owned by the government. So they picked a lot at the U.S. Naval Observatory, and they said, this is where we are going to build the house for the vice president. But public pressure demanded that they get the vice president a house right away, so they looked around and said, well, there's a house nearby that they call the Admiral's house because the Admiral always lives there. Why don't we use this house until we build the new one? So this house, built in 1893, became the official temporary vice presidential residence. Now, this became available to vice presidents starting in 1974, but it actually wasn't occupied by a vice president for a couple years. After Spiro Agnew resigned, Nixon picked a new vice president in Gerald Ford, and then Nixon resigned, and Gerald Ford became the President of the United States, never having had a chance to live in the official temporary Vice President's residence. He chose a vice president named Nelson Rockefeller, who was so rich he already had a giant mansion that was already very secure, so he used the vice president's official temporary residence as a place to entertain. Here's a picture of him entertaining President Ford and the First Lady. Rockefeller also went ahead and donated millions of dollars worth of furniture and furnishings to the home. Jimmy Carter's vice president, Walter Mondale, was the very first vice president to live in this house, and since then, every vice president has done so. After Mondale, George H.W. Bush became vice president, and he moved in there, and then he was elected president. So they put up a sign that said this was the temporary home of the 41st President of the United States. By the way, it was still considered the temporary residence of the Vice President. Gerald Ford had started construction during his administration, but then put it on hold until the economy got better, and they never restarted construction. So the Naval Academy realized they probably never were. And after George H.W. Bush and then Dan Quayle left, they decided it was time to pour a lot of money into this house, give it a lot of upgrades, fix the leaky roof, replace all the windows, and make the place as new and beautiful as a vice presidential home could be. They did this work just after Dan Quayle moved out, so Al Gore graciously lived at the Blair House in Washington, D.C., and he did that for 6 months while the house was spruced up. A lot of vice presidents have given their own personal touches. Joe Biden added a tree swing to the yard on Valentine's Day and a little plaque commemorating his love for his wife, Jill. In 2017, Mike Pence added a basketball court. Kamala Harris was the first vice president to light the menorah while living at Number One Observatory Circle. And now a new resident is going to be moving in. This will be J.D. Vance's house. And J.D., I have some suggestions for you. I found this on eBay for $20. You can get a special candle. You can just sit on the porch all day and drink out of that mug. By the way, if you haven't checked it out already, please go over and check out Patreon. You can join for free, and I'm dropping special videos over there. So if you haven't gotten enough of me, go over there and get more. You can be like Michael and Jessica, Jamie and Tom. You can be like Al, as well as my big brother Rob, and join today. In a moment, a couple boxes are going to pop up. There's going to be one on this side, one on this side. You can choose either one because I'm in both of them. On this side is going to be a video where I covered the U.S. presidents and their love for McDonald's. Otherwise, you can go check out what YouTube says is best for you. I'll see you next time.